The calling of Jesus to John. The encounter between John and Jesus occurred in a context of growing religious expectation. John the Baptist was preaching in the Jordan Valley, announcing a baptism of repentance and preparing the people for the imminent arrival of the Messiah. Many Galileans came to listen to him, drawn by the intensity of his message and the sense that something decisive was about to begin. Among those who felt called were John and his brother James. Tradition holds that both of them had already heard of Jesus before meeting him personally, perhaps from testimonies gathered in Capernaum or by the shores of the lake, where rumors spread quickly. According to the Gospel of John, the initial encounter occurred when John the Baptist pointed to Jesus as the Lamb of God. That gesture awakened in the young fisherman a mixture of curiosity and inner conviction, leading him to follow the Nazarene teacher. The account is sober, direct, almost intimate. Jesus turns and asks them what they are seeking. They respond with another question, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" And Jesus invites them to come and see. That day marked a turning point for John, not because of a spectacular miracle or a prodigious speech, but because of the feeling of having found someone whose presence radiated truth. After that first meeting, John returned to his work, but he was no longer the same. The definitive calling occurred by the shores of the Sea of Galilee when Jesus was walking near the boats of Zebedee. The Gospel of Mark recounts the scene with the precision of someone recalling an unnegotiable moment. Jesus sees James and John mending nets, calls them, and they leave their father in the boat with the hired men and follow him without hesitation. That gesture of abandoning nets, boat, and family carried immense cultural weight. In first-century Jewish society, a father's trade was almost automatically inherited. Breaking that chain was a radical choice that could only be explained by the strength of a spiritual calling. The act of leaving the nets also had profound symbolism. The net represented sustenance, security, and identity. Renouncing it was like plunging into the unknown. For John, accustomed to the hard work and stability of the family business, following Jesus meant abandoning a predictable future. There would be no material guarantees or social recognition, only the implicit promise of participating in a mission that seemed to surpass human understanding. The Gospel accounts show that Jesus' call was not just a personal invitation, but a redefinition of their lives. To James and John, Jesus called them Boanerges, sons of thunder. The nickname, mysterious and suggestive, probably referred to their energy, their drive, or the emotional intensity with which they lived their faith. That title from the beginning marked a particular relationship between the teacher and the two brothers, signaling that he saw in them a character that could be channeled into something greater. By following Jesus, John found himself immersed in a world different from that of fishing. Walks through villages and cities, the crowds that came to listen, the discussions with Pharisees and scribes, the sick seeking relief, these were all part of a new reality that expanded day by day. The pace of discipleship was no simpler than that of fishing. It demanded endurance, observation, patience, and constant commitment. But for John, it represented an inner transformation, a step from the known to the eternal. It is likely that, at first, John did not fully understand the nature of Jesus' mission. Like many Jews of his time, he expected a powerful Messiah, a leader capable of restoring the kingdom of Israel. However, Jesus' message spoke of mercy, of a conversion of the heart, of a spiritual kingdom that began within each person. John had to readjust his expectations, replacing images of the warrior Messiah with those of the Messiah who heals, forgives, and teaches. Even so, he remained close to him, trying to understand, listening to every word, and observing every gesture. The Gospels highlight that early on John was part of the closest group to Jesus. This privilege was not granted by chance. It was a response to the spiritual sensitivity of the young fisherman, his willingness to learn, and a kind of loyalty that would be fully manifested during the Passion. For John, walking with Jesus was not an obligation nor an act of blind obedience, but a relationship that deepened day by day. Leaving the nets had been only the first step. The real transformation was taking place within him, shaped by the presence of the teacher. The decision to follow Jesus also affected his relationship with his family. Although the Gospels do not detail Zebedee's reaction, the fact that the two brothers left the business implies that the family in some way accepted the calling. Salome, their mother, appears later accompanying Jesus, which suggests that the family circle supported or at least understood the magnitude of what was happening. This silent support allowed John to fully commit to discipleship without bearing the weight of disobedience or family conflict. Jesus' call was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a process that transformed John from fisherman to witness. As they traveled through the hills of Galilee and along the roads leading to Judea, John observed in Jesus an authority that did not depend on titles or military strength. In that teacher, unlike anyone he had ever known, he found a voice that penetrated deep into the human heart and awakened a longing for truth that he had never felt before. Every day confirmed that he had made the right decision by leaving the nets. John within the intimate circle of Jesus. From the early months of Jesus' ministry, John began to occupy a distinctive place among the disciples. He was not just another member of the group following him through the villages of Galilee. He was part of a small circle that had access to teachings and moments the rest did not witness. This intimate circle was composed of three main figures: Peter, James, and John. Tradition holds them as privileged witnesses of the most revealing scenes of Jesus' identity, access that profoundly shaped the spirituality and character of the young fisherman. The dynamic between them was particular. Peter, impulsive and decisive, often spoke on behalf of the group. James, the older brother of John, shared his fiery temperament and spiritual fervor. John, more introspective, seemed to observe with a mixture of awe and serenity what Jesus said and did, retaining his words with a depth that would later be reflected in his writing. Jesus did not openly explain why he chose them for certain moments, but his consistent selection indicates that he sought three qualities in them that together could grasp the fullness of his teaching: leadership, inner strength, and spiritual sensitivity. One of the most representative episodes of this inner circle was the resurrection of Jairus' daughter. When Jesus arrived at the house of the synagogue leader, he allowed only Peter, James, and John to enter. In an atmosphere filled with weeping and confusion, these three disciples silently watched as Jesus took the girl's hand and restored her to life. This kind of experience, lived in an intimate and deeply human environment, solidified in John the certainty that he was following someone whose power transcended any natural explanation. The physical closeness in that room, the compassion Jesus radiated, and the impact of the miracle were forever etched in his memory. Another crucial moment was the Transfiguration. On top of a mountain, also with Peter and James, John saw Jesus shine with an indescribable light. The account preserves the sense of astonishment. His face shone like the sun, his clothes became as white as snow, and alongside him appeared Moses and Elijah talking about what was to come. For John, who had grown up hearing the stories of these two prophets in the synagogue, that vision was a powerful confirmation that Jesus stood at the very center of Israel's history. He was not just another teacher, nor a prophet among others. He was the fulfillment of all the ancient promises, and he, a Galilean fisherman, was there to witness it. These episodes not only revealed who Jesus was, but also strengthened the personal bond between him and John. On several occasions, Jesus would converse with them privately, explaining parables or anticipating his passion. The intimate teaching had a different tone, less public, less oriented towards the crowds, and more focused on the spiritual formation of the core group that would sustain the community after his death. John absorbed these explanations with special attention, understanding that the true message was not always on the surface of the words. There were also moments that showed John's human character. In an episode narrated by the Gospel of Luke, it is mentioned that John forbade a man from casting out demons in Jesus' name because he was not part of the group. Jesus' response was a gentle but profound correction. "Whoever is not against us is for us." This exchange revealed John and James's natural tendency to interpret the mission in an exclusive way, a trait that Jesus patiently shaped. Closeness did not imply privilege to dominate, but responsibility to understand the breadth of the kingdom. Another scene that illustrates the intensity of the brothers occurs when, not being received in a Samaritan village, they ask if they should call down fire from heaven to destroy it. That impetuous reaction, reminiscent of the prophets of the Old Testament, motivated another correction from Jesus. The nickname Sons of Thunder made sense: unrefined passion, fervor that needed to be purified by mercy. John learned that spiritual strength must be at the service of love, not punishment. Despite these youthful traits, Jesus saw in John an inner purity that made him especially capable of receiving deep teachings. The Gospels present an implicit contrast. While Peter was tasked with leadership and James showed strength, John developed a relationship characterized by contemplation and faithfulness. His presence alongside Jesus was not explained only by his youthful zeal, but by a heart willing to understand the invisible behind the visible. In the final stage of the public ministry, as tensions with the religious authorities increased, the intimate circle was called into dialogues that anticipated the coming crisis. John heard directly from Jesus the prediction of his death, the announcement of betrayal, and the teachings about service as the essence of leadership. These private dialogues reinforced John's spiritual vision and gave him tools to sustain his faith when the most painful events would begin. John's closeness to Jesus also manifested in the way he moved within the group of disciples. It was common to see him alongside Peter, who considered him a necessary companion in decisive moments. Later, both would be witnesses to the empty tomb and would later work together in Jerusalem as pillars of the emerging church. The meaning of being the beloved disciple. The title of the beloved disciple is one of the most enigmatic and debated elements in Christian tradition. It appears only in the Gospel of John, never identified by an explicit name, but traditionally linked to the figure of John, the son of Zebedee. The intimate and contemplative style of the fourth Gospel has led generations of scholars to interpret this title as a reflection of a unique relationship between Jesus and the young disciple, a closeness formed not only by shared experience but by spiritual affinity. In the Jewish world of the first century, a deep friendship between teacher and disciple was a highly valued bond. It did not imply favoritism, but a particular ability of the disciple to understand the mind and heart of the teacher. Among the rabbis, it was said that an authentic disciple covers himself with the dust of his master's feet, an expression evoking constant closeness, attentive listening, and a relationship almost familial in nature. To call someone beloved in that context suggested a connection based on trust, sensitivity, and loyalty. In the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple appears in decisive moments. He is with Jesus during the Last Supper, reclining near his chest, a gesture that in Semitic culture symbolized intimacy and direct access to the host's heart. That scene not only shows affection but also the centrality of the disciple in the closest group. There he receives one of the first indications about the identity of the traitor, a sign of the trust Jesus placed in him. No other gospel describes such physical closeness, underscoring the unique perspective from which the story is told. Another crucial appearance of the beloved disciple occurs at the darkest moment of the narrative, the crucifixion. While most of the disciples had fled out of fear, this disciple remained at the foot of the cross alongside Mary and other women. The Gospel presents him as a direct witness to Jesus' last words. To describe someone as beloved in that context was not an honorary title, but a narrative evidence. He was the one who stayed when the others could not. His presence at Golgotha embodied unwavering loyalty, the fruit of a relationship formed in the intimacy of listening and contemplation. The historical question is why John received this distinction. One of the most widespread interpretations holds that Jesus saw in him a heart particularly open to spiritual revelation. Of the three in the inner circle, John was the youngest. His youth may have made him more receptive to a vision of the kingdom that challenged traditional messianic expectations. While Peter struggled with his impulse to protect and lead, and James showed the characteristic intensity of the sons of thunder, John revealed a natural ability to penetrate the deep symbolism of Jesus' words. Another literary interpretation suggests that the use of the title beloved disciple in the Gospel has a theological purpose to show the reader the ideal of the perfect disciple, one who listens, understands, remains, and bears witness. From this perspective, the title does not exclude the other disciples but functions as a narrative tool to highlight one way of following Jesus. However, the patristic tradition agreed in identifying the beloved disciple with John, noting that his first-hand testimony is reflected in the depth and contemplative style of the Gospel. It has also been debated whether the title could have a symbolic nuance related to the Johannine community, a group of Christians who, according to some scholars, preserved and transmitted John's teachings. For them, the beloved disciple would represent the spiritual authority of their teacher rather than an autobiographical figure. Still, even this interpretation acknowledges that the figure refers to a real disciple whose closeness to Jesus became the foundation of a theological tradition. Beyond the debates, what is certain is that the bond between Jesus and John holds a unique place in the Gospels. John not only understands the words of the teacher, but also captures his tone, his silences, and the deep meaning of his gestures. When the Gospel of John states that the Word became flesh, or that God is love, it reflects a contemplative experience that would hardly have arisen without an intense relationship with the person of Jesus. Being beloved in this context meant being transformed by that closeness. The title also suggests that John perceived in Jesus something more than just a teacher. Compared to the other disciples, his gospel presents Jesus with an unprecedented theological depth: the eternal Logos, the light of the world, the good shepherd who gives his life for his sheep. This understanding is not improvised. It is born from daily living together, from hours spent listening to the teacher, from moments of shared silence, and from the emotional impact of seeing him heal, forgive, and reveal God's character in every gesture. An additional element that reinforces the connection between John and the beloved disciple is the scene at the empty tomb. When Mary Magdalene announces that the tomb is empty, Peter and the beloved disciple run to it. The account details that the disciple arrives first, but allows Peter to enter first. The scene combines youthful agility, respect for Peter's authority, and a deep sense of love that translates into early faith. He saw and believed. This detail links the experience of the resurrection to the special sensitivity of the beloved disciple. The title reappears at the end of the Gospel, when the risen Jesus approaches the disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It is the beloved disciple who first recognizes the Lord from the boat. That instant, almost intuitive recognition summarizes the essence of the bond. John does not need signs or explanations. He knows his teacher's voice even from a distance. The key moments in which John was present. John witnessed some of the most significant and revealing episodes of Jesus' ministry. His constant presence in critical, intimate, or profoundly symbolic situations made him one of the privileged witnesses of the Master's public life. These moments not only reveal the importance Jesus placed on his companionship, but also the depth with which John interpreted the events, leaving marks that would later influence his own theology and the Christian memory. One of the first key episodes occurred in Cana of Galilee, where Jesus performed his first public sign, the transformation of water into wine at a wedding. Although the Gospels do not mention the list of attendees, tradition and the style of the fourth Gospel suggest that John was present, as the narration has the tone of someone who closely observes an extraordinary event in an everyday setting. The miracle at Cana revealed an essential aspect of Jesus' ministry, his ability to transform reality in silence without fanfare, using the ordinary to reveal the extraordinary. John grasped this symbolism early on, as he would later remember this sign as the beginning of the revelation of the Master's glory. The episode that confirmed John's closeness within the inner circle was the resurrection of Jairus' daughter. In moments where the presence of crowds could hinder a deep understanding of the miracle, Jesus allowed only Peter, James, and John to enter the room where the girl lay dead. That scene, filled with emotional tension, showed John an intimate aspect of Jesus' compassion. The tenderness with which he took the girl's hand and the silent power that restored life where there had only been despair. These types of experiences shaped John's vision of the light capable of overcoming darkness, a concept that would later be central in his writings. Another decisive moment was the Transfiguration. Peter, James, and John accompanied Jesus to the top of a mountain, where the Master revealed himself in a glory beyond all human understanding. For a young Jew like John, raised with stories of Moses on Sinai and Elijah on Horeb, seeing these two prophets conversing with Jesus was a revelation that united past, present, and future in one scene. The voice that came from the cloud saying, "This is my Son, whom I love, listen to him," sealed in John's heart a deep conviction about the divine identity of Jesus. That experience would not be repeated at any other moment in his life, but it would remain a spiritual reference point that guided his understanding of the nature of Christ. Beyond the miracles and extraordinary visions, John was also present during moments of private teaching. The Gospels narrate episodes in which Jesus would take a small group of disciples aside to explain parables or to anticipate future events. These conversations were often filled with symbols that required a contemplative mind. John, with his spiritual sensitivity, absorbed these teachings with particular depth. The intimacy of these moments forged in him a unique perception of themes like light, truth, love, and eternal life. One of the most intense episodes occurred in Gethsemane, in the garden where Jesus often withdrew to pray. There, on the eve of his passion, Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to accompany him closer than the other disciples. The Master, deeply anguished by what was about to happen, shared with them a vulnerability that he rarely showed in public. Although all three fell asleep at various times, John witnessed the inner pain of Jesus, heard his words of surrender, and felt the spiritual weight of the moment. This direct contact with the suffering of his Master would leave an indelible mark on his memory and his later understanding of sacrifice. He was also present during several miracles where Jesus' sensitivity to human suffering was revealed. The multiplication of the loaves and fishes, for example, was an act of mass compassion that John saw not only as a material prodigy, but as a spiritual sign. The bread that satisfied physical hunger foreshadowed a deeper nourishment that Jesus would offer to the world. Similarly, the calming of the storm showed John Jesus' power over creation and the serenity with which he faced chaos. Each of these experiences formed in him a unique conviction about the Master's identity. John was also a witness to encounters with the Pharisees and religious authorities. These confrontations were tense and revealed the growing conflict between Jesus and the institutions of his time. Seeing the Master defend mercy over legalism and truth over political convenience influenced how John understood the kingdom of God. Over time, these moments would contribute to his steadfastness in the face of persecution and his ability to sustain the Christian community during difficult times. An episode that marked the relationship between Jesus and John occurred when the sons of thunder asked to sit one at his right hand and the other at his left in his glory. Although the request likely came from their mother, John was exposed as a young, ambitious person who was still immature in his understanding of the kingdom. Jesus corrected them firmly, teaching them that spiritual greatness is measured by service and not by honors. John learned that closeness to Jesus meant responsibility, humility, and a willingness to give one's life for others. Finally, one of the most emblematic moments in John's life occurred during the Last Supper. There, reclining near Jesus' chest, he had access to confidences that no other disciple heard. That gesture of closeness anticipated the painful events to come and showed that John was destined to play an essential role in the darkest moments of the Passion. The flight of the disciples and the courage of John during the Passion. The night Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane marked a decisive turning point for the group of disciples. Until then, they had faced tensions, veiled threats, and moments of uncertainty, but nothing compared to the violent intrusion of soldiers and guards sent by the religious authorities. The darkness of the garden, the sound of armor, and the silent betrayal of Judas unleashed a fear that overwhelmed them all. In a matter of seconds, the group that had walked together for years dispersed, each seeking to save their own life at the prospect of being arrested along with their Master. The Gospels describe this moment with stark honesty. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. The phrase encapsulates the collective panic that took hold of them. Peter, who hours earlier had proclaimed his absolute loyalty, stepped back. The others ran off among the olive trees, confused and terrified. The arrest of Jesus was not just an emotional blow, but a political threat. Being associated with a detainee accused of defying the authority of the temple could mean death. The decision to flee was human, understandable for any disciple caught in that nocturnal scene. However, amid that chaos, John took a different path. Although he too was afraid, he decided to follow Jesus from a distance. The Gospel of John provides a revealing detail. He had some prior relationship with the high priest, which allowed him access to the courtyard where the religious trial was taking place. Although the exact nature of that relationship remains a mystery, its existence opened a crucial door. While Peter remained outside, trembling by the fire and trying to go unnoticed, John entered the area where Jesus was facing tense interrogations, accusations, and blows. His presence in that courtyard marks a break from the initial flight of the others. He was not there to intervene, but to silently accompany Jesus in the early hours of his passion. The scene is particularly significant because it reveals John's inner courage, a young fisherman moving among authorities, guards, and accusations with the serenity of someone who refuses to abandon his master, even though he could do nothing to defend him. During the religious trial, Jesus was questioned about his teachings and his disciples. At that moment, John understood that his closeness to Jesus was no longer a spiritual privilege, but a real risk. Being identified as a follower could make him an immediate target for arrest. Yet he remained there, silently observing Jesus' dignity in the face of blows and false accusations. This presence is no small gesture. In the contrast between Peter, who denied his master 3 times out of fear, and John, who stayed close even in danger, the emotional difference between the 2 disciples is revealed. When Jesus was brought before Pilate at dawn, the crowd had begun to gather. The atmosphere became more hostile, more unpredictable. In this context, John continued to observe from a distance, watching every move in the process that would lead his master to the crucifixion. The Gospels do not describe his emotions, but Christian tradition has always seen in this silence a profound testimony. John suffered the passion not from flight, but from closeness. John's courage became even more evident when Jesus was taken to Golgotha. While most of the disciples remained hidden out of fear, John made the decision to publicly stand with the women who wept at the foot of the cross. To be seen there was to expose himself to the authorities, to the soldiers, and to the hostile crowd. However, John chose faithfulness over personal safety. At the foot of the cross, John found himself in a space filled with brutality and symbolism. Jesus, weakened and agonizing, became the object of mockery and violence. The women, among them Mary, his mother, clung to the closeness as an act of love and resistance. John joined that small remnant that did not allow Jesus to die alone. He was the only one of the apostles to take that risk. His presence was not only a gesture of love, but also of testimony. John witnessed with his own eyes the harshest reality of the passion, the nails, the thirst, the insults, the trembling of the earth, the final cry. While others only heard later accounts, John was there, living each moment with a pain that would mark him forever. The Gospel of John has a short but decisive phrase to mark this. He who saw it bears witness, and his testimony is true. This statement is not a literary formality, but a direct declaration of the emotional impact that experience had on him. The Gospels do not mention any words from John during the Passion. His silence at the cross is in itself a message. The disciple who had once shown youthful impulses now remains still, firm, accompanying in silence. This contrast reveals a maturity born from suffering and faithfulness. John did not flee from pain. He contemplated it, held it, and embraced it. When the death of Jesus was consummated, John remained close. He witnessed how a soldier pierced the side of the crucified and how blood and water flowed from the lifeless body. This almost clinical detail is narrated with precision in his Gospel, probably because he saw it with his own eyes. For John, this sign had a profound spiritual meaning, but before it became a symbol, it was a physical, painful, and real fact. The presence of John at the foot of the cross. The scene at Golgotha was marked by the sound of the hammer, the shouts of the crowd, and the painful resignation of those who accompanied Jesus. Among all those who witnessed the crucifixion, John occupied a unique place. He was the only one of the 12 who remained there, exposed to the soldiers, clearly identified as a disciple. His decision to stay at the foot of the cross, at a time when most had fled or remained hidden, revealed an inner strength that contradicted the youth he still held. The crucifixion was the most brutal spectacle Rome offered to subjugate conquered peoples. It was not only meant to execute, but also to humiliate, terrify, and psychologically break those who were condemned. To witness it up close meant seeing agony without filters, the labored breathing of the condemned, the tension of muscles straining to hold the body up, the blood slowly descending, the sweat mixed with dust, and the silence alternated with cries of pain. John positioned himself in this scene of extreme suffering, not as a spectator, but as a disciple who refused to abandon his master in his darkest hour. With him were Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Mary the wife of Clopas, and other women who had followed Jesus from Galilee. Tradition highlights that the women did not flee, which reveals a contrast with the male disciples. By joining them, John became part of that small circle that resisted social pressure and fear of the authorities. His presence was an act of loyalty that placed him in a vulnerable position. Any guard could suspect him. Any member of the Sanhedrin could recognize him as a disciple of the accused. But John chose to remain. The physical closeness of John to the cross has profound symbolic and emotional dimensions. One of the most revealing details of the fourth gospel describes Jesus looking down from the cross and seeing his mother and the beloved disciple. They were not distant spectators. They were close enough to hear broken words, to distinguish every gesture, to perceive the suffering of the Master not as a theological concept, but as a heartbreaking reality. Christian tradition has seen in this scene the moment when John transitioned from the role of disciple to that of a faithful witness. He did not contemplate the death of Jesus as a distant event, but as an occurrence that marked his own identity. John's presence at the cross was not motivated by the hope of a final miracle, but by a silent commitment, the conviction that he must accompany Jesus even when the kingdom he had proclaimed seemed to be falling apart before everyone's eyes. The pain that John witnessed in Jesus was of incomparable intensity. The Gospels highlight the thirst, exhaustion, and words of abandonment that reflected the depth of Jesus' physical and spiritual suffering. John heard these words directly without intermediaries. He also saw how the soldiers divided Jesus' clothes, an act that represented the final humiliation for one condemned to death. The young disciple witnessed humanity at its most brutal, mistreating and mocking the man he recognized as God's sent one. As the agony continued, John remained there, holding Mary and being held by her. That silent exchange of pain created a bond that Jesus himself consecrated when he spoke one of the most significant phrases of the Passion, "Woman, here is your son," and then addressing John, "Here is your mother." These words, spoken from the cross, entrusted to John a responsibility that went beyond biological kinship. In a culture where caring for widows was a sacred duty, Jesus entrusted his mother to the disciple who had shown unwavering faithfulness. From that moment, John was not just a witness, he became an active participant in the most intimate circle of Jesus' suffering. He took on the care of Mary as a direct act of obedience to the agonizing Master. This commission revealed a level of trust that no other disciple received at that instant. John symbolically became the spiritual heir to the care of Jesus' family. John's presence allowed subsequent narratives to include details that only an eyewitness could have recorded. He saw when a soldier to confirm Jesus' death pierced his side with a spear, and he witnessed blood and water flow from his body. This detail, recorded only in his gospel, suggests the precision of the memory of someone who was there at the exact moment. For John, this sign was not only a confirmation of death, but a revelation that would later acquire a profound spiritual meaning. The charge of Jesus to take care of Mary. The moment when Jesus entrusted the care of his mother to John is one of the most intimate and revealing scenes of the Gospel. It was not a ceremonial act, nor a formal instruction, but a gesture spoken in the midst of agony, with his breath labored and the weight of his body hanging on the cross. In that moment of extreme pain, Jesus addressed his mother and the beloved disciple to seal a new relationship that would have a decisive impact on John's life and on Christian memory. The phrase, brief and simple, resonated with intensity. "Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother." With these words, Jesus established a familial bond between two people who did not share blood, but shared faith and the experience of pain. For first-century Judaism, filial responsibility was a sacred duty. A son was expected to ensure the well-being of his mother, especially if she was a widow. The absence of Joseph in the Passion narratives indicates that Mary no longer had a husband. Therefore, the responsibility had to fall to the children. But by entrusting her to John, Jesus showed that spiritual bonds could transcend biological ties. The fact that Jesus did not entrust Mary's care to one of his biological brothers, mentioned in the Gospels as James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, has sparked analysis over the centuries. The most common explanation is that these brothers were not his followers at that time, whereas John had already shown absolute faithfulness. Jesus trusted that John would understand the spiritual and human dimension of his request. It was a symbolic act that defined the essence of the new community, a group united not by blood but by shared faith and mission. Christian tradition has always interpreted this charge as an act of love and trust. Jesus, in his final hour, did not think of himself, but of his mother's vulnerability and John's willingness to assume such a deep responsibility. The pain Mary experienced in the face of her son's suffering was immense. John, who had been with her since the beginning of the crucifixion, had seen her tears, had sensed her broken silence. and had felt the need to support her as the body of Jesus weakened on the cross. Jesus' command formalized that emotional bond and elevated John's mission to a spiritual level. The Gospel states that from that hour the disciple took her into his home. This phrase indicates an immediate, almost instinctive decision. John understood that obeying Jesus in that moment meant opening his home, reorganizing his life, and assuming the role of protector and comforter for Mary. Although it is not specified where they lived afterward, the earliest tradition holds that John first took her to live with him in Jerusalem, where the Christian community was beginning to form, and later possibly in Ephesus, when the apostolic mission expanded beyond the borders of Judea. This commission had deeper implications than mere cohabitation. Mary, the mother of Jesus, carried a unique experience. She had accompanied her son from the Annunciation to the cross. By living with her, John received an intimate testimony that no other apostle shared. It is reasonable to think that many of the theological reflections that later appear in his gospel were fueled by prolonged conversations with Mary. Her presence solidified in John a more contemplative and spiritual vision of the mystery of Christ. Tradition assures that Mary became a truly maternal figure for John. He, who had lost the master but gained a mother in the heart of the faith, found in this relationship a source of comfort and strength. For the nascent Christian community, seeing John and Mary together was a sign of continuity between Jesus' earthly life and the post-resurrection mission of the apostles. She, a witness to the incarnation, and he, a witness to the passion, represented two pillars of apostolic memory intertwined in the same home. The commission also had an impact on John's spiritual authority. By receiving Mary, he became not only a disciple but the custodian of the intimate memory of Jesus. His gospel reflects a unique sensitivity toward the mystery of the incarnation and the identity of Jesus as the Son of God, themes that resonated deeply in the Marian tradition. This perception did not arise from abstract analysis, but from daily living with the Mother of the Master, sharing silences, memories, and prayers. The participation of John in the resurrection. The early hours of the first day of the week began with an unusual air, filled with silence and foreboding. After the death of Jesus, the disciples had scattered and sought refuge in closed houses, afraid of the authorities. John, though deeply affected by the events of Golgotha, remained in Jerusalem alongside Mary, undergoing a silent mourning that accompanied every breath. No one imagined that this mourning would definitively break the reign of fear. The Gospel of John recounts that it was Mary Magdalene who burst into the house where some of the disciples were gathered, announcing that the tomb was empty. The message was unsettling. The stone had been rolled away and the body was gone. She did not yet speak of appearances, only of absence. For John, who had seen with his own eyes where Jesus had been laid and how the tomb had been sealed, the news sounded like a blow, mixing fear, hope, and confusion. Death had been an irrefutable fact. How could the tomb be empty? John and Peter ran to the tomb. The account preserves a detail that seems insignificant, but that tradition has interpreted as a sign of John's youth. He arrived first. This was not just about physical speed, it was the image of a heart burning with the desire to understand, to see, to touch the reality that defied logic. However, upon reaching the tomb, John stopped at the entrance. He saw the linens there, orderly, but did not enter. Prudence and respect made him wait for Peter, who, upon arriving, entered without hesitation, driven by his decisive spirit. When Peter entered, he observed the linens and the cloth that had been folded separately. There were no signs of theft, no disorder, no violence. Everything was strangely ordered, as if death had not been interrupted by human hands but transcended from within. Then John entered as well. The Gospel describes that moment with a phrase that has marked Christian spirituality. He saw and believed. He did not see the risen Jesus in that moment. He only saw the empty tomb, but in the absence he perceived a presence. John's faith in the resurrection was born before he saw the risen one. His spiritual intuition, forged through years of closeness with Jesus, allowed him to recognize in the linen wrappings and the silence of the tomb an unmistakable sign. Other disciples took longer to understand. He understood from the first glance. That act of early faith would make him one of the most important witnesses of the resurrection within the early Christian community. After the discovery of the empty tomb, John returned with Peter to meet the other disciples. Though fear still lingered, the atmosphere had changed. The possibility that Jesus had conquered death began to pierce through the darkness that had paralyzed them. However, it was not until that same evening when Jesus appeared to a group of disciples gathered in a house with the doors locked. John was there when Jesus stood among them, saying, "Peace be with you." The experience was transformative. The Jesus who appeared was not a vision or a spirit, but someone with a real body, capable of showing the wounds of the crucifixion. John, who had been at the foot of the cross, immediately recognized the marks that had formed under the violence of the soldiers. This continuity between the crucified and the risen was one of the key theological themes of the Gospel of John. Life was not a denial of death, but its victory. In the weeks that followed, John was a witness to other appearances. One took place at the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus appeared while the disciples were fishing. While they were still in the boat, it was John who first recognized the Master in the figure calling them from the shore. That ability to recognize immediately was a natural extension of the relationship they had during the ministry. John did not need additional proof. He knew the voice, the gesture, and the look of Jesus. This appearance included a detail that reinforced John's authority within the group. He was the one who whispered to Peter, "It is the Lord." Peter, as impulsive as ever, jumped into the water to meet him. John's gesture of perceiving first, understanding first, and pointing to others became a defining feature of his role in the community. He was not the visible leader, but the deep witness who recognized the presence of the risen one before anyone else. In addition to witnessing appearances, John participated in the mission that Jesus entrusted to his disciples after the resurrection, to proclaim the good news and forgive sins. This mission, rooted in the personal experience of the empty tomb and encounters with the risen one, marked the transition from the fearful disciple to the courageous apostle. John was no longer just the young man who had witnessed the cross. He was a witness to the definitive life that overflowed all human limits. The resurrection of Jesus also gave new meaning to the charge John had received at the foot of the cross. Taking care of Mary now took on a new dimension. She too would be a witness to her son's victory. Living with the mother of the risen one, John became the keeper of a double memory, that of the crucified Son and the glorified Son. His faith was nourished both by the experience of pain and by the joy of the resurrection. From the resurrection onwards, John began to occupy a key place in the early Christian community. His eyewitness testimony, his early faith, and his discernment gave him spiritual authority recognized by all. He would not be the most dominant figure, as that role would fall to Peter, but he would be one of the quiet pillars whose theological depth would shape Christian identity. John as a pillar of the early church. After the resurrection of Jesus and the multiple appearances that confirmed the continuity between the crucified Master and the glorified Lord, the disciples gathered again in Jerusalem. Initially fearful, later encouraged by the experience of the risen one, and finally strengthened by the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, they began to organize themselves as a stable community. In this process, John emerged alongside Peter as a fundamental figure in the early steps of the nascent church. The book of Acts constantly shows John alongside Peter. It is no coincidence that both appear together in decisive episodes: the healing of the lame man at the Beautiful Gate, the defense before the Sanhedrin, and the supervision of preaching in Samaria. This partnership reveals an apostolic bond that was recognized by the entire community. Peter was the spokesperson, the visible leader. John, for his part, was the solid presence, the reliable witness whose authority rested on his closeness to Jesus, his faithfulness in the passion, and his spiritual understanding of the events. One of the most emblematic episodes was the healing of the lame man who asked for alms at the temple. Peter and John found him at the entrance called the Beautiful Gate. When the beggar asked for alms, Peter replied, "I have no silver or gold, but what I have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk." John was there, supporting with his presence the act that would open a new chapter of public proclamation. The crowd was amazed, and the religious authorities quickly intervened, alarmed by the growing movement proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. Both apostles were arrested and brought before the Sanhedrin. During that interrogation, John remained steadfast alongside Peter. For the religious leaders, facing two of the closest disciples of Jesus was unsettling. They had seen them accompany him during his ministry, Now they saw them preaching with conviction and courage. John's spiritual authority did not depend on lengthy speeches, but on his silent testimony. His presence reinforced the credibility of the apostolic proclamation. The Sanhedrin, unable to deny the miracle and fearful of the popular support, decided to release them with threats. But Peter and John responded with a phrase that would be remembered for centuries: "We cannot help but speak of what we have seen and heard." This statement summarized the essence of the apostolate. John did not speak of theories or inherited traditions, he spoke of lived experiences. The resurrection for him was not a spiritual concept, but a concrete experience that had transformed his life. This certainty fueled his courage in the face of threats and strengthened the unity of the apostolic group. With the growth of the Christian community, internal challenges emerged. The distribution of goods, the organization of services, and the preaching to different cultural groups required greater coordination. In this process, John became consolidated as one of the pillars of the church, alongside Peter and James, the brother of the Lord. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, explicitly refers to these three as the main authorities in Jerusalem. For Paul, who had a personal encounter with the risen Christ years later, receiving the recognition of John was a crucial endorsement for his mission among the Gentiles. John's authority was based not only on his experience with Jesus, but also on his character and spiritual maturity. He was seen as a pious man, capable of discerning the needs of the community and offering guidance without imposing rigid control. His sensitivity, shaped by his experience at the foot of the cross and his relationship with Mary, made him particularly close to the suffering believers. The early communities viewed him as an apostle who understood both the human dimension of the gospel and its theological depth. The journey to Samaria was another decisive moment in the apostolic mission. After hearing that the Samaritans had received the word of God through the preaching of Philip, the apostles sent Peter and John to confirm the authenticity of the movement. This journey had special symbolism because during Jesus' ministry, the Samaritans had been viewed with suspicion by the Jews. Now John, who in his youth had asked for fire from heaven to destroy a Samaritan village, returned not to destroy but to bless and affirm the inclusion of new believers. This profound change speaks of a spiritual transformation forged by years of faithful following of the gospel. In addition to his participation in Jerusalem and Samaria, John witnessed the growth of the community in a hostile environment. Persecutions began to increase, especially after the martyrdom of Stephen. Many disciples fled to other regions, carrying the fledgling faith with them. John, however, remained in Jerusalem for a time, supporting the believers who could not emigrate and strengthening the unity among the apostles. The written work attributed to John, the figure of John, not only consolidated as one of the pillars of the early church, but also as a decisive literary voice. Over time, Christian tradition attributed to his name a collection of writings that, due to their style, theological depth, and unity of vision, have shaped Christian thought for centuries: the Gospel of John, 3 epistles, and the Apocalypse. Although the exact authorship of each has been the subject of academic debate, the spiritual identity that runs through them points to a common origin in the Johannine school, formed around the beloved disciple and his living memory of the Master. The Gospel of John is the most unique of the 4 Gospels. It does not follow the detailed chronological structure of Mark, nor the synthetic approach of Matthew and Luke. Instead, it unfolds a more contemplative narrative focused on revealing the deep identity of Jesus. From its outset, it is clear that the intention is not merely to narrate events, but to interpret the eternal mystery that is manifested in the life of the Son of God. This theological vision, both elevated and intimate, reflects the sensitivity of a disciple who lived with Jesus not only through external events, but in the inner understanding of his message. The Gospel of John stands out for its use of long speeches, symbols, and metaphors. Jesus is presented as the light, the living water, the bread of heaven, the good shepherd, and the true vine. These titles are not literary embellishments. They are spiritual keys that reveal the nature of the Messiah in a way that the other Gospels only hint at. The Johannine style demonstrates a deep knowledge of Jewish thought while also being open to dialogue with the Hellenistic world. This balance is precisely what characterizes a witness formed in Galilee, but matured in a multicultural environment like Ephesus, where John is believed to have spent his final years. One of the most notable characteristics of the fourth gospel is the emphasis on love as the core of the Christian life. The episode of the foot washing, for example, is narrated in detail only by John. That gesture, which reveals the essence of Christian service, is accompanied by a new commandment: love one another as I have loved you. The emotional and spiritual intensity of this scene reflects the memory of someone who was there, who heard those words from the physical closeness that John himself had during the Last Supper. The relationship between the gospel and the beloved disciple has also generated numerous interpretations. The text itself hints that its author was an eyewitness to the events, especially the Passion and the Resurrection. The precision with which the crucifixion, the piercing of the side, and the recognition of the risen Jesus are described reinforces the impression that the author was part of those events. Although some modern scholars propose the intervention of later disciples or editors, the ancient tradition firmly maintained the authorship of John or a community that faithfully preserved his testimony. The 3 letters attributed to John reflect the same literary style as the Gospel, though with a more pastoral tone. The first letter is a passionate call to live in truth and love. It repeatedly affirms that God is love, a statement that condenses John's theological experience with a depth that no other New Testament author expresses in such a direct manner. This letter also responds to internal tensions within the Christian communities, defending the real incarnation of Christ against currents that denied it. The insistence that the Word became flesh suggests that John was appealing to his own experience as a witness to the earthly life of Jesus. The second and third letters are shorter and more personal. They offer clues of a network of small communities that maintained contact through itinerant messengers. The emphasis remains the same: fidelity to the original teaching, brotherly love, and the need to live in truth. Here John appears as a respected elder, someone whose authority does not stem from a position but from the consistency between his life, his testimony, and his teaching. The Apocalypse, on the other hand, presents a very different style. It is a prophetic and symbolic book that describes visions of judgment, hope, and the final consummation. Although some scholars believe it was written by a different John, tradition early on associated it with the apostle due to his authority and his connection to Ephesus. The visions of the Apocalypse, filled with vivid images such as the Lamb slain, the New Jerusalem, and the final battle against evil, are not intended to be read as a literal account of the future, but rather as comfort and exhortation for communities persecuted under the Roman Empire. John in Ephesus and his final teaching. Over the years, John's mission expanded beyond Jerusalem. The most solid tradition, recorded by authors such as Irenaeus, Polycrates of Ephesus, and Eusebius of Caesarea, indicates that John eventually moved to Asia Minor, settling in the city of Ephesus. This city, one of the most important centers of the Roman Empire in the region, was a strategic location for preaching, teaching, and guiding Christian communities, growing in a multicultural environment full of religious, philosophical, and political tensions. Ephesus was a vibrant metropolis, famous for its trade, port, and the temple dedicated to Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Jews from the diaspora, Greeks, Romans, traders from the East, and pilgrims from all over the world converged there. Living and teaching in such a place required sensitivity, doctrinal firmness, and a deep understanding of human diversity. John, with his experience of life alongside Jesus and his spiritual maturity, became the ideal figure to support and guide the local Christian communities. Tradition holds that John took on a pastoral role of great influence. He was not just a teacher, he was a wise elder, a spiritual father whose authority stemmed from his direct testimony of the Lord. The Christians of Asia Minor sought him out to hear his teachings, receive advice, and resolve doctrinal disputes. His presence reminded them that the faith they professed did not come from abstract ideas, but from the life and words of the Master, whom he had known intimately. One of the most striking aspects of John's final teaching was his insistence on love as the foundation of Christian life. While other apostles had emphasized aspects like mission, doctrine, or community organization, John focused his message on a single conviction: without love, faith loses its essence. Early church writings tell us that when he was already elderly and could barely speak, his disciples would carry him before the community. There he would repeat a simple phrase: "Little children, love one another." When they asked him why he always insisted on the same thing, he would respond, "Because it is the commandment of the Lord, and if you fulfill it, that is enough. This insistence did not stem from empty sentimentalism, but from the living memory of Jesus. John had seen the Master wash the feet of his disciples, embrace the marginalized, forgive his enemies, and lay down his life without resistance. He had heard the radical statement, "By this all will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." In his old age, John understood that the survival of the church in a hostile world depended more on the consistency of love than on any structure. John also faced theological challenges in Ephesus. Various groups began distorting the figure of Jesus, denying his humanity or reinterpreting his message. One of the most serious issues was docetism, a belief that claimed Jesus only seemed to have a human body but did not actually have one. For John, who had seen, touched, and accompanied Jesus throughout his life, this teaching was intolerable. His first letter begins with a definitive statement: "That which we have heard, that which we have seen with our eyes, that which we have looked upon and our hands have handled, we declare to you." His insistence on the incarnation became an essential doctrinal pillar. Ephesus became a center for training new Christian leaders. Among the later generations, Polycarp of Smyrna stood out, claiming to have been a disciple of the Apostle John. Through figures like him, Johannine teaching was passed on for decades, strengthening the church in the face of internal crises and external persecutions. Tradition also holds that it was in Ephesus where John wrote or dictated his gospel. The work reflects the spiritual maturity of someone who had dedicated his life to meditating on the words and actions of Jesus. It is not an impulsive narrative or merely biographical. It is the synthesis of profound reflection, developed in the final stage of his life. This is why Johannine theology highlights themes such as light, truth, love, and eternal life with a clarity that can only come from prolonged contemplation. In Ephesus, John developed a close relationship with the local communities who faced pressures from the pagan environment and in some cases sporadic persecutions from the empire. John's message offered comfort and strength. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. This conviction encouraged the church to persevere, reminding them that Christ's victory had already been manifested in the resurrection. The exile on the island of Patmos. John's exile on the island of Patmos is one of the most significant and mysterious episodes of his life. The Christian tradition, recorded as early as the 2nd century by authors like Irenaeus and later confirmed by historians like Eusebius, holds that John was banished there during a Roman persecution. Patmos was a small, rocky, barren island practically devoid of vegetation, located in the Aegean Sea. The Roman Empire used it as a place of confinement for political or religious prisoners. It was not a physical prison, but a forced isolation where the exiled person was cut off from the world, without the freedom to return and with minimal resources for survival. The most likely historical context for John's exile points to the reign of Domitian, the Roman emperor from 81 to 96 AD. This emperor is remembered for his authoritarian tendencies, his consolidation of the imperial cult, and his persecution of groups who refused to worship him, including Christians. In various provinces of the empire, tensions existed between the authorities and Christian communities, especially when these communities refused to participate in public ceremonies requiring incense offerings to the emperor. In such an environment, an influential leader like John, known throughout Asia Minor, became an obvious target. The move to Patmos meant a break with his community in Ephesus. There, he had spent years teaching, writing, and guiding believers. Now, he had to face solitude and uncertainty. Tradition does not describe the details of his arrival on the island, but it is easy to imagine the elderly apostle walking those rocky hills, enduring the constant winds that battered the coasts, and seeking refuge in caves or small makeshift structures. Exile, more than a physical punishment, was an attempt to silence his voice, isolate his influence, and hinder the growth of Christianity in Asia Minor. However, Patmos became the setting for one of the most extraordinary spiritual experiences in all of biblical literature. John himself, in the book of Revelation, states that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day when he received a series of visions that transformed his exile into a place of revelation. The external circumstances became the framework for a mystical experience that provided the church with a book full of symbols, images, and promises addressed to persecuted communities. The Apocalypse is not a linear narrative, but a series of visions that John describes using deeply symbolic language. The figure of the slain lamb, the seals, the trumpets, the riders, and the fall of Babylon represent the spiritual and political conflicts that the Christian communities were enduring. Although many details of the book have been interpreted in various ways, its central purpose is clear: to offer hope to believers who were suffering under imperial oppression and to reaffirm that the final victory belongs to Christ. To understand the impact of these visions on John, one must consider his personal situation. On Patmos, with no access to temples, no community fellowship, and no support from other leaders, the experience of receiving such a powerful message must have been both a source of comfort and consecration. The elderly man who had been at the foot of the cross, who had seen the empty tomb, who had lived with Mary, and who had guided the church in Ephesus, now found in the revelation the confirmation of his mission: to proclaim God's faithfulness even in the midst of persecution. One of the most notable aspects of the Apocalypse is its connection to the communities of Asia Minor. The 7 letters addressed to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea reflect the deep knowledge John had of the specific situation of each. He did not write from the indifferent distance of an exile, but from the pastoral heart of someone who knew their difficulties, temptations, and struggles. Even on Patmos, John continued to be a pastor. His warnings, praises, and exhortations show that his concern for the churches did not cease with his exile. Tradition holds that John's exile was not prolonged. After the death of Domitian in 96 AD, his successor Nerva adopted a more tolerant policy toward the persecuted and allowed the return of many exiles. It is believed that John then returned to Ephesus, bringing with him the visions he had received. The apostle's return must have been a moving event for the community, an elderly man who had withstood the weight of the empire now returning with a message of hope for a church that was growing amidst both internal and external tensions.